This is Liberty Law Talk, part of Liberty Fund's online library of law and liberty. Your host is Liberty Fund Fellow Richard Reinsch. Our web address is libertylawsite.org, where you can subscribe, comment, find other episodes and links related to today's conversation. Our email address is lal@libertyfund.org. Today we're discussing with John-Mueller his book, Redeeming Economics, Rediscovering the Missing Element. John-Mueller is the Lehrman Fellow in Economics and Director of the Economics and Ethics Program at the Ethics and Public Policy Center, and he is also the president of LBMC LLC, a firm specializing in economic and financial market forecasting and economic policy analysis. Also, from 1979 to 1988, he served as economist and speechwriter to the great Congressman Jack Kemp. Mueller's articles have appeared in the Wall Street Journal, the Financial Times, the Harvard Business Review, Washington Post, and National Review. John, great to have you. I'm excited about discussing your book.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me, Richard.
So, John, I want to start really with the title, Redeeming Economics. I think that's a provocative title. Why does economics need to be redeemed, and what do you propose as the redemptive agent or agents?
Well, I use the term redeeming in one of the less frequently used dictionary senses of fulfilling a promise or pledge. My mother used to redeem S&H green stamps for toasters or whatever, books mostly actually, and we redeem bottles for the deposit we put down on them. So I use the term, although there's there's a play on the religious sense of redeeming. The religious sense actually comes originally from the economic sense, and that's in the economic sense that I use the term redeeming, that is fulfilling its original promise. The basic argument of the book is that the original scholastic economics had a complete picture of the human person and an economic theory that fit that picture, and subsequent changes in economics have pared away the most important element, hence the subtitle of the book, Rediscovering the Missing Element, and that's the one that describes our interpersonal relations. And so if, as I believe, we are entering what might be called a neo-scholastic phase of economics, following the neoclassical and classical phases, then I think that economics will have fulfilled redeemed its original pledge. And that's the reason for the title of the book.
Let's talk about this missing element. Rediscovering the missing element. And talk more about what is the missing element. It seems to be from your book, scholastic economic theory has compared to neoclassical economic theory and what preceded that, classical economics. What does scholastic economic theory provide that we need to incorporate in economic analysis, according to your opinions?
Well, the original theory of economics was put together in the 13th century by Thomas Aquinas from elements that he drew from two men, Aristotle and Augustine of Hippo. And this comprehensive picture of human nature was embedded in the natural law philosophy of the medieval scholastics. Scholastic meaning, of course, merely schools, because in the Middle Ages, universities were called schools. And what Aquinas did was to combine four elements from Aristotle and Augustine, which described production, exchange, distribution, and consumption. And these four elements were discussed and worked out for about 5 centuries before Adam Smith came along and tried to do a drastic simplification of economic theory, which resulted in so-called classical economics in his great book, The Wealth of Nations, in 1776. But about a century after Smith, so-called neoclassical economists realized that Smith's simplification was an oversimplification, that by getting rid of Augustine's theory of utility, which describes our choices about consumption, he had removed economists' ability to describe certain important aspects of human life, and so they have spent about the past century trying to restore that and explore the implications of that restoration. But that leaves one element, the most important element, the element of distribution, which describes our interpersonal relations of love and hate, which are always expressed by love is always expressed by some kind of a gift, and the opposite, hate, by instead of my giving to you what belongs to me, I take from you what belongs to you. And so the theory of distribution, Augustine's theory of personal gifts and their opposite crimes, and what Aristotle called distributive justice, which is sort of a collective gift, is the element of distribution that describes how we express our love and hate towards other people. And this is the most important missing element in economics that the book argues is necessary to solve most of the most pressing problems in economic theory today. And its difficulty in describing the real world as we experience it.
Well, I want to talk more about final distribution a little later, but I want to focus on. So you think economic analysis begins with, or doesn't begin, but is perhaps best presented in scholastic economic theory, and that would begin with Thomas Aquinas. And Aquinas really synthesizes and incorporates insights not only from Aristotle, but also from Augustine. In the book, you quote at length, describe at length, Joseph Schumpeter's description of Aquinas' economics, but that he doesn't really do much beyond what Aristotle proposed. Now, you disagree with that, and you note a crucial part for Aquinas is Augustine and this theory of final distribution. But most people, when they hear that, I think might scratch their heads excuse me, for really a couple of reasons. And I think, one would be a dynamic economy. Could Aquinas' theory really account for that in any real way? They might think of his, or recall that he has some fairly severe prescriptions on usury and interest, and also thinking that he has probably a pretty strong conception of politics and the state, and that this would actually heavily interfere in markets because you're trying to pursue some sort of good, as a scholastic would understand it. There's a strong collective good that has to always override private exchange, and that would, maybe heavily restrict economic growth. But I think, what do you say to that? People might just say, how does he even understand entrepreneurialism or dynamic investment or finance or things like that?
Well, I think it's important to begin by distinguishing the history of economics, which is the history of the theories by which we attempt to describe our economic relations in the real world, and economic history, which is the course by which our economy progresses. For example, the United States from mostly agricultural to beginning to manufacturing to services, and that the economic theory is the analytical toolkit that we use to describe economic history as it unfolds. And so when you ask about Thomas Aquinas, how could someone in the 13th century describe a modern economy? Well, he was describing a much less developed economy, one in which markets were much less perfect than we are used to today. And I talk a little bit in the book about those differences. And yet we recognize many of the scholastic solutions almost spontaneously. For example, when the terrorist attacks on September 11th, 2001, shut down the commodity markets in New York because of the attack on the World Trade Center, several state regulatory agencies prosecuted those filling station owners who raised the gasoline price merely because merely because they could, but there was no restriction of supply. The markets had merely been closed by the terrorist attacks, And that was a spontaneous application, I think, of what we do when we're faced with imperfect markets. And so we still have a great deal to learn, even today, about dealing with such markets. And we deal with them, say, if we have a housekeeper who speaks imperfect English or something, and that we have a certain amount of economic power with respect to her, there are still certain moral obligations upon us not to take full advantage of what we could do. And so I think that actually the analytical toolkit, which the book is all about, is important even in describing the most modern economic developments of the U.S. economy.
Let me talk some about Adam Smith and you spent a lot of time thinking or writing that Adam Smith reduced economic science. He drops off distribution and he drops off consumption or utility and focuses on production and exchange. And yet you also kind of walk through, and it's interesting, so what would have been the intellectual, or what would have been the ideas Adam Smith would have encountered in his own education and from his own sort of mentors and teachers, and it would have been the scholastic economic science you describe. And of course, you also note that Samuel Pufendorf brings brings a scholastic economic science at the time, and even his ideas filter into a lot of the American founders or significant American founders' educations. So I guess the question is why does he do it? It's not a question, according to you, of ignorance, but he makes a conscious choice to drop off these other factors which you argue are so important, like final distribution. Why do you think he does it, and what are the consequences to economics from that?
Well, you're right that Adam Smith was taught scholastic economics by his own teacher, Francis Hutcheson, who taught him from an annotated version of one of Pufendorf's, a compendium of the natural law, sort of a Protestant version of the natural law, written in the late 17th century, which was studied and applied by many of the American founders. Alexander Hamilton, for example, mentions Pufendorf as one of the important influences. Hutcheson was also fascinated with the Stoic philosophers, the ancient Stoic philosophers, and Smith apparently became a convinced Stoic philosopher himself, and in one sense he was the last of the Stoic philosophers. And it's a philosophy which, unlike biblically orthodox, say, Christianity or Judaism, or even the Enlightenment deism that was current at the time, did not believe that there was a God who created the universe, but rather that the universe was God. It's sort of a pantheistic view of nature. And the theory of moral sentiments, which was published first in 1759, by its final edition was an advertisement for Stoic philosophy. In fact, it began with an advertisement for Stoic philosophy in the sixth edition. And so Smith was heavily influenced by Stoic philosophy. And in my view, if you read what Smith wrote and how he understood his own thinking, I believe it's a key to unlocking why he did what he did in oversimplifying the economic theory he had inherited.
So in thinking about the Stoicism for Smith, what is that? Talk about that in economics. What does that mean precisely? What does that take away? What does that add, if anything, to how he does economics? In particular, I'm thinking, the idea of the sentiments, and also, but versus, say, the self-interest of Wealth of Nations. Those are two sort of disjointed ideas, I think, in those books, and it's, people try to reconcile them. A lot of economists do, those two books and the two ideas they're working from, but essentially they always struggle to do it. But also, how does this relate? And I think it's important because you seem to note or argue that there is an anthropology behind, say, scholastic economics, behind classical economics and neoclassical economics. And so I just want to help people who are hearing this for the first time to understand how this all relates and works out in the realm of economic analysis.
Right. Well, Stoic philosophy, the guiding principle was not reason, as in the case, say, of biblically orthodox natural law, in which God is described as the divine logos or reason, so that everything is, the whole creation is, in the whole creation one can discover reasonability, or it all makes sense. In Stoic pantheism, the universe is uncreated matter, but sort of animate matter that is imbued by a world soul, and this world soul is God. Now, the implication for human nature is that humans, if they are actually some sort of appendage of this God who is the universe, don't really choose ends or means through reasoning about their choices, but rather they are, as it were, God's puppets who are fated to do what they do, and because they're driven by their sentiments. The word sentiments in the theory of moral sentiments is very important, because Smith spends a great deal of time attempting to establish that we do not choose through reason, but rather God, what we attribute to our own reason is in fact the providence of this divine soul of reason which permeates the whole universe. And this is what actually, this is where the invisible hand comes from, that even though humans might do things for evil or foolish reasons, everything all works out for the best, because this divine Stoic providence brings it about, despite the unreasonability of humans in their own many of their own choices, which Smith attempts to establish.
So you write about Adam Smith and the labor theory of value. I mean, so and you argue it seems that the scholastics don't reduce production to just one element, and that
right.
seems significant. So why does he do that? Why do you think he does that?
Well, besides his Stoicism, Smith and most thinkers of his time were heavily influenced by what they believed that Isaac Newton had done to what they called natural philosophy. We would call just general physics. And what Smith believed that Newton had done was to boil all of physical nature down to a single principle of gravity. And so he was always trying to boil moral philosophy down to a single universal principle. But in attempting to do so, he wound up oversimplifying. He eliminated the theory of utility because it implied that we reason about our choice of means.
Oh, that's interesting.
Rather than being impelled by our internal moral sentiments to do so for reasons beyond our understanding.
Okay.
And similarly, he removed the theory of distribution, that the rational choice of our how we choose to distribute our wealth between ourselves and other people, which is how we describe our interpersonal relations. I mentioned earlier that love, we always express love with some kind of a gift, and objective hate with some kind of a crime towards others. And Smith eliminated both elements because they implied that we are rational animals, and he was always attempting to establish that it is the sentiments which drive our what we believe is our reasoning. And so
then he switches though in Wealth of Nations, and there's something, and this is a part of your economic analysis, and I want to get into this theory of final distribution that you describe at length, and constantly, you put this in the book as a way to think about failures in modern economics. So you think about Smith's famous quote, it's not from the benevolence of the brewer, the butcher, the candlestick maker, if I'm getting that correctly, but it's actually from their self-interest. Their self-regarding actions actually produce wealth and economic opportunity, things that can be traded and exchanged. And you argue there's something missing there, which is that actually one could care for one's customers or for one's suppliers, but do so from a theory of utility. But the utility isn't as flat as, say, a lot of economists would make it.
Well, yes, in a sense, modern neoclassical economics attempts to boil everything down to the principle of utility, which Smith himself, as I mentioned, had removed from the scholastic outline. Smith himself, as I mentioned, because of his what might be called his moral Newtonianism, was trying to boil things down to a single principle. And in the theory of moral sentiments, he announced that this principle was sympathy, which he had to redefine from the ordinary meaning of compassion to a sort of an ability to understand the sentiments of others. But when he got to economics, sympathy didn't really work, and so he announced in the theory in the Wealth of Nations that the all-embracing principle was labor. And so he argued, whereas the scholastics had explained the value of instrumental goods, economic goods, as a result of our ranking of other things by their value to us. For example, if I prefer vanilla ice cream to strawberry ice cream to Brussels sprouts, that's
right.
Shows a scale, what might be called a scale of preferences, and this is how the scholastics had, going back to St. Augustine, had described the theory of value. But having eliminated that, Smith had to come up with something in its place, and that's where the theory of the so-called labor theory of value came from. He announced that the value of anything was not caused by its usefulness to human beings, but rather by the amount of labor that was that we bestowed upon producing them. And Karl Marx didn't misunderstand this theory, but rather understood it very well when he took it to its logical conclusion and announced that if workers are in fact providing all the value, then capitalists must be parasites and could be eliminated or expropriated without any harm. And that was one of the unfortunate side effects of the labor theory of value, and it was in fact one of the motivations of the so-called neoclassical economists who had to deal with the rising wave of Marxism and communism, and the use to which classical economics was being put by Karl Marx in order to support that theory as a supposedly scientific theory. So it really goes back to Smith's oversimplification, in effect trying to be too clever by half in boiling everything down to this single all-embracing principle. But as you said earlier, he really never succeeded. He couldn't do some kind of magnum opus in which everything was interconnected, because he never explain how sympathy, which he had previously announced was the all-embracing principle in moral philosophy, what exactly that had to do with the similarly all-embracing principle of labor, which he expounds at great length in the Wealth of Nations.
I want to talk now, and so we've kind of discussed it in part, but this theory of final distribution, I mean, as I read it, I think about what you're saying, that we always act with regard to other persons, and we use means as a way to satisfy ourselves or others, and that, if I'm getting this correctly, and this is kind of left out of contemporary economic analysis, but and I want to talk about an interesting example in the book from, and this is I think Philip Wicksteed described as the mother's problem. And he says the way you would begin economic analysis, the way you should begin, is not with Robinson Crusoe, but it's actually with a mother deciding how she's going to distribute goods amongst her children, amongst her family, and sort of the judgments she has to make in that regard. So I guess maybe that's a way to start. I mean, what does this theory of final distribution add, and in a way that classical, neoclassical economics just doesn't have the toolkit to understand.
Right. Well, many of the classical economists tried to use the example of a Robinson Crusoe, somebody who was set down without any friends, family, or other connections on a desert island, and used him as an example, Crusoe as an example of how to think about economics, because it helped them simplify the discussion. But as you mentioned, Philip Wicksteed said, rather than taking someone who is shorn of interpersonal relations, it's much better to use an ordinary mother because she comes loaded with interpersonal relations. And if we want to describe life as it is actually lived, we should try to describe what a typical mother does, and she solves a problem a dozen times in a day that Wicksteed himself confessed that he could not solve through modern neoclassical economics. It does go back to the theory of distribution, and especially to the contributions of St. Augustine of Hippo, who described the way in which we, in effect, always act on the basis of not one but two different scales of preference. The more fundamental one, our scale of preference for persons, whom we rank first, second, third, and so forth. And for example, when I say I love vanilla ice cream, what I really mean is I love myself, and I provide the vanilla ice cream to myself in order to express that love. But similarly, we describe our interpersonal relations through a ranking of persons. If there were only two people in the world, you and I loved you equally with myself, then I would give you the use of half of my wealth and keep the other half for myself. And that's the way that Augustine looked at it. But if I loved you half as much as myself, then I would keep 2/3 and give you 1/3, and so forth. And so he viewed not just the theory of utility, which he was the first to describe, but also the theory of interpersonal distribution as depending on our scale of preference for persons, love or its opposite, hate. And this was really the most important element that Aquinas used as an organizing principle to integrate these four principles which he had collected from Aristotle and Augustine.
I guess it's still not clear to me. I mean, this is really what I want to focus on. It's not clear to me what this adds to or indicates about a failure of contemporary economic reasoning. And specifically, my question to you is, so with the mother's problem, doesn't she come to the market with her preferences already based upon what she has to do at home? Knowing who she has to feed, who she has to take care of, and the way she's going to rank that. Doesn't she translate that into the market through her purchasing decisions, through her production decisions, and thus everything seems to cash out? I mean, I guess I'm just trying to understand how what you're saying, what it adds. That's my question.
Well, when she goes to the market, she has in mind the preferences, not only her preferences, but also the preferences of the people for whom she intends to provide for her children. Say, if she's planning a dinner for friends, she has to know not only what she would like to eat. I mean, she might prefer to cook and serve Brussels sprouts, but she knows the preferences of her guests, and therefore she provides roast beef instead. So what her personal preferences are do not govern what she does, but rather it's her attempt to please her friends and family, to express her love for those people. And similarly, when a married couple provides for their children, they have to go through a kind of a joint decision-making process. For a while before we had kids, my wife and I was earning all the income in our family, and my wife was earning none of it in the labor market. And yet, at the end of the day, and now it's more equal because our kids are grown and have flown the nest. But at the end of the day, early or late, we had to sit down together and decide, no matter where the income came from, whether I produced more of it from the labor market or she produced more of it, we had to sit down at the end of the day and decide how much would go for our kids' college tuition or replacing their play clothes or whatever. And so it's the attempt to express one's love for the other persons in relation to ourselves that scholastic economics consider the most important element, but which Smith removed from classical theory and which has not yet been restored by neoclassical theory. I go in the book into several empirical problems for which the predictions are opposite for modern neoclassical economics and what I call neo-scholastic economics, in order to show that restoring this missing element is necessary for economists to do what they're supposed to be doing, that is to describe the world. Instead of telling the mother what to do, sitting at her feet and learning what she's doing, that is, I think, what a piece of advice from Wixty that economists need to follow. But to do that, I think we need to heed the teachings of Augustine.
So let's talk about that. I mean, I think that's what people are going to be interested in. So, and I'm just going to return to that question. So what does this add to economic analysis, and in particular, these sort of empirical parts you referenced with regard to, I don't know, inflation, unemployment? You have an interesting example with the Freakonomics book, the bestseller book from a decade back, which provocatively argued that abortion rates have resulted in a 50% drop in crime from, say, abortions that would have been in the 1970s and crime rates in the 1990s. I mean, how does this all cash out? I mean, kind of incorporate this idea of final distribution into what's missing and what could be better if we had it in our analysis.
Right. That's possibly the most striking example of the empirical existence of what I call the Augustinian distribution function. As you mentioned, Stephen Levitt, in a series of papers with John Donahue in the early 2000s, tried to argue that the institution of legal abortion in the United States from the late 60s and with Roe v. Wade in 1973 was what caused a sharp drop in the crime rate in the 1990s. But in their original papers, Levitt and Donahue actually could not distinguish between the effects of 1970s abortion rates and 1990s abortion rates on the crime rate. When they put everything into their models, they went haywire, which economists call multicollinearity. They led to nonsensical results.
What is that?
It just means that what you're trying to describe is so closely interrelated with the variables you're trying to use to describe them that you're getting nonsensical results because of the missing variables. And what I argue is that what Levitt and Donahue missed was the theory of distribution. They, in their original paper, they argued that their results depended on the assumption that there has to be a lag between abortion and crime because, as they put it, infants commit little crime. But the quip overlooked the fact is that most crimes, especially the most violent crime of all, which is homicide, are committed by men precisely the ages of the fathers of the aborted children. There is something that I call economic fatherhood, which is not just biological paternity, but the provision for one's children. And I attempt to measure that by adjusting the total fertility rate for by removing the men who are in prison and therefore cannot take care of their own offspring, and the children who are on welfare and therefore not being supported by their fathers. And so this ratio of economic fatherhood has a near perfect, well, a 90% inverse contemporary correlation with the homicide rate. And what this does is disproves the notion that there must be a lag between abortion and crime. In fact, there's an immediate relationship between economic fatherhood and the crime rate. And so when abortion was introduced or legalized, the crime rate went up immediately because a large, actually not a large, but a small but steady share of the population was turned from fathers to being single men without children, a small but steady share of whom do commit crimes. And the curve that shows this strong inverse relationship is perhaps the most striking illustration of the shape of the curve described by the mathematics I suggested earlier, that we express our love for other people through gifts and our hate toward them through crimes. So the chapter in the book about that is one of the starkest examples in which neoclassical economics leads to predictions that are diametrically opposed to what I call neo-scholastic economics and diametrically opposed to empirical reality.
So I guess I'm just trying to tease all this out and understand this, because there's a lot that's packed into what you've said. And I think it strikes, it's going to be new to a lot of people. And so I'm just trying to understand precisely. So Levitt and Donahue go wrong because they assume what about people in regards to these decisions like crime and abortion, and of course their positive economic analysis leads to, more abortion, less crime. And you're arguing that they don't take into account that if people who are committing crimes are not other regarding in any significant way, obviously, and therefore are going to father children that are more likely to be aborted. I mean, I guess I'm just trying to understand your argument.
We can use our time for one of two purposes, or some combination of both. That is, we can devote most of our time and resources to ourselves or to other people, and we can't do both at the same time, at least if we're using finite goods. And so if as in the 1950s, American men have their hands full raising families, they have less time to get into trouble, basically, and to commit crimes. But whereas when abortion was legalized in the late 60s and early 70s, suddenly a significant share of the men were turned into who ordinarily might have, because of the previous convention of what you might call shotgun marriages, were turned back into men without dependent children. So the expression of our love or hate for others relative to ourselves is what Donahue and Levitt were leaving out of account.
Okay. I want to move on, and maybe we can close with this. You have a theory of American public choice. You contrast that with the theory of public choice most people who would be familiar with that term know has the public choice of James Buchanan, Gordon Tullock, and others, which famously posits that bureaucrats and those working in government, those trying to shape public policies, are just as self-interested as those in the markets, in the private markets. And so the notion of people in government being primarily concerned about the common good, whatever that is just false. It's not empirically true. But you argue that this is deficient, and that there's actually an American public choice that's much richer, and we should consider. Talk about those two ideas, if you would.
Right. Well, the theory of public choice certainly had its merits in the sense that it was only applying to the theory of the realm of politics what economists had done for economics by assuming universal self-interest. So in that sense, it exploded some inaccurate myths, but in the process, it committed a few of its own. The theory of American public choice differs from the theory of public choice in that the theory of public choice says that the people are motivated by what they can get out of their government, in effect, the benefits of holding office. And the theory of American public choice says, as in the Federalist Papers, that the end of government is justice, not self-interest. I mean, not self-interest is my comment, not the Federalist Papers. It also argues that voters' interests should be essentially randomly distributed, and that if they are randomly distributed, then this is what would account for the two-party system. But James Madison, in his theory of faction upon which the Federalist Papers and the U.S. federal system was based, argued that factions arise from differences in interest that we have. For example, if we're owners of so-called human capital, then we will tend to act one way. If most of our income comes from the return on our labor, we'll vote one way. But if most of our income comes from property compensation, interest, dividends, and capital gains, then we'll have a different set of interests. And I show that the American National Election Studies show that James Madison's description fits the current data, which go back to about 1948, very well, whereas the theory of public choice does not. So it's not trying to diss the theory of public choice, merely pointing out that there are.
How so? I mean, that's a big claim. What do you mean? Just some examples.
What do you want me to clarify? Sorry.
No. I mean, you said American election data going back to 1948 show James Madison to be correct and the public choice theorists to be wrong. And but that's kind of a big claim. And so I was just wondering what's some pieces of evidence in that back that up. That's interesting to me.
Well, it's the way that American voters vote or identify themselves and vote by their partisan self-identification, whether they identify themselves as Republicans, Democrats, or Independents. And what I show in the book is that according to the American National Election Studies, which have been conducted for every national election going back to 1948 or 52, depending on the question, they tend to vote quite systematically on the basis of not only the level of their income but the source of their income. Republicans tend to identify themselves to the extent that their family income comes primarily from property compensation, interest, dividends, capital gains, rents, and real estate, whereas Democrats tend to identify themselves and vote according to whether most of their income comes from labor compensation, and this the data show a very close correlation between these economic interests and the way that Americans vote. I mean, even in the most recent national elections, whereas, as I mentioned, if you read Buchanan and Tuck's books, they argue that the voters' interests might have been originally connected to some political party, but over time they are merely randomly distributed But what the American National Election Survey shows is that, in fact, they are not randomly, very systematically distributed according to the source of and level of income of the voters. Republicans vote one way in close alignment with their economic interests, and Democrats another way in alignment with theirs, and independents are somewhere in between. So that's
okay. Well, I mean that seems interesting to me. I mean, because I would think Buchanan and Tulloch would say people would vote their economic interests. That would be what they would do naturally. I mean, I think what's interesting is how many wealthy people vote for center-left candidates, which would be against their economic interest. And it seems to me the only people who seem to fairly represent their economic interest in their voting are a lot of people in the Tea Party movement, who I think of kind of middle-class guys working in private sector jobs, not highly successful, but certainly getting by and able to provide for their families, et cetera. So I guess that's what I was really trying to understand. So what is the American public choice that you're talking about? What's fuller about that? Why does that work better?
Well, as I mentioned, the end of government is not trying to capture the advantages of office, as is a fundamental premise of the libertarian theory of public choice, but rather the principle that Madison stated when he said justice is the end of government. And the reason I think that equal treatment of labor and property income, say in taxation, the reason why Ronald Reagan's tax policies were successful both economically and politically is that they tried to treat Wall Street and Main Street more as equally as possible. The so-called Kemp-Roth tax rate cuts and the Tax Reform Act of 1986 both got the tax rates down for everyone, and in the latter case closed a majority of the loopholes to special interests. And that was successful, I think, because it was the most just, or at least the least unjust. When you have two parties who are trying to, in effect, to shift the tax burden upon the constituents of the other party, Republicans attempting to shift the tax burden primarily onto labor income, and Democrats trying to shift the tax burden onto property income, what is the most successful, the most popular or least unpopular policy is to treat everyone as equally as possible. And that, I think, is why the Reagan program was the most successful in recent memory, and because it was in accord with the principles of that James Madison and Alexander Hamilton stated in the Federalist. People vote their interests, and those interests are not randomly distributed, but are quite systematic, depending on where we get our income from.
John, thank you for being on the show and discussing your book, Redeeming Economics, Rediscovering the Missing Element. It's been a great conversation. Thank you.
Richard, thank you.
This is your host, Richard Greinch, and you have been listening to a podcast that can be found at libertylawsite.org, where you can subscribe, comment, and find other episodes and links related to today's conversation. Our email address is lal@libertyfund.org.